Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Phillip Lomax. I'm Executive Vice President of Business Development at MediaScience. And today, I'm joined by my mentor and dear colleague, Dr. Duane Varan, founder and CEO of MediaScience. This afternoon, we're bringing you some incredible programming about our recent research on the 2024 presidential debates. This is a historical moment for our company. We've done a lot of this type of research before, and I can't wait for you to share some of the context, Duane. But thanks so much for joining me here today.
Always a pleasure. I look forward to it.
Excellent. So let's pull up our presentation and get started, shall we?
Sounds good.
What we endeavored to do is a multi-tool approach to measuring the 2024 presidential debates. And as Duane will explain a little bit later, there's some incredible context as to why this research is so important. But in order to accomplish this research, we used a multi-tool approach involving our 3 laboratories in Austin, Texas, Chicago, and New York, as well as StreamPulse, our connected television research platform that accessed homes across America, and online focus groups in partnership with our colleagues at Ipsos post-session using the platform that we're all on today, which is HeartConnect. So feel free to interact with this session however you see fit. You can use those tag buttons to tag key moments that you find interesting. And you can also chat us questions, which we'll answer at the end of the session. But without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Dr. Duane Varan, who will give us a bit of context and tell us what those insights were.
Fantastic. So as Phillip was explaining, we have a lot of tools. We probably have the deepest tools in the industry in terms of making sure that we have every tool and the expertise associated with it to really be able to dive in. And the debates are a really good example of where those tools become useful, because there are rational dimensions to how you want to understand how people process the debate, like in terms of how people weigh up the arguments, and there are emotional dimensions to it. And the emotional dimensions are really key in terms of understanding the kinds of reactions that people have that they may themselves not even be aware that they're having. This is particularly the case we often see with Trump, for example. So we have this really deep toolbox. And as you were saying, we have a couple of proprietary solutions. We have StreamPulse, which is, to the best of our knowledge, the only CTV channel in the industry that is a dedicated research channel. So you download StreamPulse like the way that you would download Netflix or any other kind of like TV platform. And then within that, we have some technology that helps us measure people for the debate. And then, as you were saying, we also have HeartConnect, which of course everybody is on right now, which is our qualitative platform. Again, proprietary, developed at MediaScience with a whole bunch of really cool AI tools. Now, we were the first in the industry to start using neuromeasures for the presidential debates. It went back to 2012, the Biden-Romney debate. And every debate has a very different personality. There are things that we learn in each debate which are very unique, which are very different to what the mainstream press are reporting at the time, but which really help us gain insights in terms of what's really happening in the debate.
And actually, Duane, it was this case study from 2016, Trump versus Clinton, that convinced me that I needed to make the effort to come work with you at MediaScience. So I'm really excited for you to share
that's
this
great.
insight.
Yeah, so the 2016 is probably the most interesting study we've ever done. I mean, it was a really interesting one. You have to remember, at the time in 2016, everybody was saying it was going to be the biggest landslide in history.
I remember.
This was right after the sex tapes, so everybody thought that, that Trump was toast. And certainly the rational measures in our study said exactly the same thing. The dial testing, the survey responses, even what people told us, everything was reinforcing that narrative. But the neurometric data told a completely different story. And there were a lot of really powerful insights. One, Democrats hated Hillary. This was really fascinating for us. The minute she started speaking, the negatives among Democrats were what we typically see when an opponent is talking.
That's wild.
And that was shocking for us, right? The other thing that we discovered was that people desensitized to Trump. Everybody, undecideds, Democrats even. So the first time he said something really outrageous, there was a really intense reaction. The second time, a little bit less. The third time, a little bit less. And you could see over the night that the intensity of those reactions just diminished until the point where it was almost just slipping right off of people's backs. But the most important thing that we discovered was what happened with undecided voters. And for undecided voters, there was a clear conflict. Their rational data was all Hillary, but their emotional data was all Trump. And so, for example, when they would ask policy questions, Hillary tended to be very evasive. She didn't want to lose a voter. And so she would say, you should read my book, but she wouldn't answer the question head on. Where Trump would be very decisive, but he'd be lying through his teeth. So he'd say, for example, in my first 100 days, I'm going to do this. And the rational argument maybe didn't appeal to people, but that confidence, that decisiveness that said in my first 100 days, for undecided voters, that was really powerful. So on the basis of our data, what we argued was that this was not a runaway election, that this was a razor-thin election, because you were talking about an election that would come down to an emotional versus rational conflict. And so that was the big insight that grew out of that particular study.
One particular insight, and the reason why I think these tools, especially neurometrics, are so valuable, was isolating the contribution of the specific communication tactics of each of the candidates. So obviously, I think we can call out Benghazi, the email scandal regarding Clinton, but when Trump actually shared the story of former President Obama landing in China and the Chinese not bringing out a stair lift so he could disembark Air Force One, right? These types of tactics that might have slipped under the radar from traditional polling are very interesting.
Yeah, that's right. So what's great about these measures is that they are second-by-second measures. Yeah. And so you're really looking at every second of the debate to understand how people respond. One more note while we're on that. Another really big difference between the way that MediaScience has done all of these elections is when you look at, for example, dial tests, which is the longest tradition that we have for something that will give us like a second-by-second measure, if you will. That's what you guys are used to seeing maybe when you're watching on television and you see a little line squiggly that's going on screen, which is showing how a group is responding. Almost always that research is done on undecided voters.
Indeed.
And the reason that it's done with undecided voters is because they're viewed as the cohort that will ultimately make the difference. What we discovered at MediaScience was that it's just as important to measure Republicans, just as important to measure Democrats. Because elections are not just about what happens to the undecided voters, it's also about voter turnout. And voter turnout is about how those constituents who are party supporters, how they will ultimately respond. So for example, our conclusion in the 2016 debate was that dislike that the Democrats had for Hillary would be a challenge for voter turnout for Democrats. So you saw this massive voter enthusiasm gap between Republicans and their support for Trump at the time and Democrats and their support for Hillary. And that could potentially. So if you weren't measuring Democrats and Republicans as well as the undecided voters, you'd miss that. So that's a big part of the research in this year's research as well, where a lot of other people would have focused on the undecided voters. Yes, we looked at the undecided voters. It was very uneventful, actually, for the undecided voters. That data is very boring data, very neutral for the whole debate. The real interesting data in this particular study, actually, is what we'll see with Democrats. And I'm giving a little bit of foreshadowing here in terms of what our results are going to be. So let's talk a little bit more about, our methodology. We had two primary tools or two environments that we were primarily testing in. We had in-home testing that we did with the dial. Again, those of you who know about dial testing, typically the way this is done, like when you watch it on television, is there's a device that people hold, which is called the dial. And it has a dial on it that you turn to say whether you like or dislike what someone is saying.
It's kind of like a kitchen timer in some ways.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. With a little LED readout on it usually. And you're looking at, maybe it's a 1 to 10 scale, and you're indicating your response. But of course, that has a number of limitations. One, you have to drop your eyes off the screen to look at the LED readout. Two, you have to have everybody in the same room. So what we've done is we've significantly improved that technology. And it's one of the tools among a palette of tools that we have inside our Stream Pulse platform, which is our CTV channel that we do. I was talking about that earlier. And the way that it works is you have a little thermometer that appears. So in this illustration, you can see that little thermometer in the upper left-hand corner. And that thermometer is a 7-point scale. It's blue in the middle for neutral. I like it a little, I like it medium, I like it a lot. So there's 3 green dots that go up. Or I dislike it a little, I dislike it medium, and I dislike it a lot. And what happens is you just use the up and down arrow key on your own remote control at home. So people are using their own TV, they're using their own remote control, and they're just using the up and down arrow key, very intuitive. So you can do it very easily without dropping your eyes off the TV. And you can do it at home, which means we can have a national sample. So that's what we did. And then the second method that we had, of course, was in lab. In lab, we get the deeper measures, the electrodermal activity, which is also called galvanic skin response. That tells us about the intensity of the reaction, but not the direction of the action, just how intense people are. Then we use facial coding, facial expression analysis. People who are born blind at birth display exactly the same emotions as everybody else with their facial gestures. And so we can analyze the muscle movement on the face to determine what we call valence, which is we see an intense reaction in the GSR data, for example, but how do we know whether that was positive or negative? How do we know if you really liked what Trump was saying or if you really hate it? Both would have a very intense reaction, but you have to tell the direction of that. And that's what the smiling data and also the dial data helps us in terms of interpreting.
So just to break it down before we dive into these insights, right? This type of approach is bespoke and unique to MediaScience in that we have command of such a breadth of tools. So for our audience that may not be familiar or as much of a wonk as we are, we have the rational interpretation via Dow results in homes across America, greater, I think, than 200 homes that we collected. We also have a sample in our labs for the non-conscious response, right, that we collect through the neuro tools, facial expression analysis. And the facial expression analysis kind of acts as a check and a balance between the rational liking or disliking and the actual facial expressions of the audience. And of course, post-session, we did an in-depth survey, and then after we followed up with in-depth conversations using HeartConnect, this qualitative research platform that you're on today. So what did we find across all of these different measures?
Absolutely. So again, this is actually something that we will continue analyzing for many months because it's such a rich, incredibly powerful data set. So we'll explore it. So for example, we have been doing follow-up work with the panel, looking at alternative candidates that they might have considered, like Kamala Harris, for example, or Gavin Newsom and stuff, and breaking down the data again even further in terms of understanding how they reacted to the debate. So there's still a lot more to come. But let me give you a couple of the really big highlights that we see already. The first is we want to know what were the key moments in the debate. And there were really 3 key moments in the debate. One was what you might call the senior moment, where Biden kind of like lost his train of thought, I guess, and then reconnected, but it was on a different topic, kind of. There was that moment. There was another moment during the abortion debate, surprisingly. This is an issue that normally, of course, would be very strong for Democrats. But midstream through that, Biden lost his train of thought and he started talking about immigrant women who might be raped, and this was not, immigrants, potentially raping someone, this kind of thing. It was a really, it wasn't a smart argument for him to be raising in the context of the whole abortion debate. That had an intense reaction. There was the moment when Dana Bash asked Trump about whether he would accept the results. The question itself was a very evocative moment. So there were these kind of like key moments. And we analyze these a number of different ways. One thing we do is we create a storyboard of the entire debate. So every time that a candidate speaks, we create a panel for that candidate. And we can look here at both the neurometric data. Here we're looking at the galvanic skin response, which is the top curve that you look at. We also look at the dial activity. So in this particular, if you look at the top right-hand corner, I have an example of a panel. This is during the immigration debate. And we can see at the start of that debate, Trump says something, I don't remember quite exactly what it was, but he says something that evokes a very intense neurometric response, but only among Republicans. And we can see, is that positive or negative? We can look at it and we can see it's positive from the dial data. So now the combination of these two tell us that Republicans really liked this argument. So we're able to go through kind of like the entire debate, each time that a person was addressing a topic, and we can look at each issue. And we blow it up a little bit. So here we're looking at the first kind of like 4 opportunities to speak during the section on the economy. And so this is like one way that we can analyze the debate. Or we can look at the debate in its entirety. So this is showing us, for example, the dial data. And if you look at this, one thing you notice with dials is that partisans always respond for their candidate.
It makes a lot of sense to me.
Yep. So if you're a Republican, when Trump is talking, you're cranking the dial up. When Biden's talking, you're cranking the dial down. And that typical pattern is what you see if you look at the red line. You see this roller coaster where it's going extremely positive, extremely negative, extremely positive, extremely negative. If you look at the purple line, which is the undecideds, you have a very neutral pattern. This is very typical. Not a lot of swings, not a lot of strong, intense like, strong like, intense. It's pretty much neutral, a little bit up, a little bit down. Sometimes there may be a moment where they get a really strong, intense reaction. That's interesting. There wasn't a lot of that in this debate. They were pretty neutral all the way through. But the most interesting trend here that we see is with the Democrats. And again, we'll talk to that a little bit more. But here, if you look at the debate, you'll notice the ups and downs for Democrats are very mild. You're not looking at that intensely. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So this is another way that we can look at the whole debate.
So just to recap a bit for our audience members that might not be, dealing with this type of data every single day, regarding the storyboard that we just discussed, it's almost like we work backwards in a way, right? Rather than creating a feature film or creating a television show in which we storyboard out each of the critical moments, the inciting action, the climax of an event. What we've done is we work backwards and we've deciphered the inciting moments and the climax of this particular live event. So the applications are actually universal in many ways.
Yeah, they're fantastic. I mean, again, for me personally, the most interesting part of the debate in terms of the reaction of the audience to it was the segment on abortion again, which normally would have been catastrophic for Trump.
Yeah.
But in this case, it actually didn't go so bad for Trump. And again, that storyboard format helps us see that kind of story, if you will. And then we also have another way, which is what we call our neurodial. So here you're looking at our neurodial. This is really cool. You're looking at the neurometric data. There's actually 2 different ways that we report the neurometric data. Again, it's too much detail to explain today, but you're looking at that in time. So you're able to see at the bottom, you have the overall trend of it. So you can see kind of like where this moment is in the course of the debate. But then you have the micro, kind of like second by second. And then you also have the dial activity, which is those bars to the right. So it allows you to really quickly interpret, are we looking at a positive thing, a negative thing? Like, what is this reaction? So that's another way. All right, let's get to some of the key trends that we saw in the data. And there's 2 really big trends that come out of the data that I think are very significant in terms of what the results were. The first is, let's now take all the moments in time when Trump is speaking and let's plot them all. Let's take all the moments when Biden is speaking and let's plot them all. And what you see here is, again, in both cases, you see that positive, negative trend that we talked about for Republicans. But now look with what's happening with Democrats. Look at when Trump is speaking. There is no intense negative. This is very atypical for Trump. What we are used to when Trump is speaking, we're used to seeing very intense negatives among Democrats. Democrats were so stunned by what happened on the night. They were like stunned mullets.
Yeah.
They were like deers in the headlight that they didn't react to this debate. Their response was actually what we see for the undecideds who are very neutral. They were responding in a very neutral way to Trump, not in a negative way. Very unusual, very strange pattern. I'd be surprised if we saw a pattern like this again in the future, but this was a very unique night that way. And also, of course, perhaps not surprisingly, their positives for Biden are very light, very soft. So we're not seeing positives, but we're also not seeing negatives, which again, so they were pretty much neutral like undecided voters would be. If we look at gender, there are a lot of interesting trends as well. The first is women were actually more engaged in this debate than men were for much of the debate. So this is very telling. I mean, that can be, we see a lot of variability in that debate to debate. But if we break it down by party, if we break the women down by party, again, we're seeing that same thing. So here we're looking at when Trump is speaking among Republicans, and we're looking at when Trump is speaking when
Biden is speaking.
When Biden is speaking, yeah. And again, we see this pattern that we just talked about there. And I had one more slide I was going to show here, which I just realized I didn't have, which is what was happening with Republicans and Democrats. And again, very similar to the pattern we talked about earlier, where female Democrats were not negative when Trump was talking.
I mean, but when you look at the data, as you can see on your screen, you could just see these massive peaks and valleys for female Republican voters or females when Trump is speaking, but they're totally middle of the road.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, very acharacteristic of what we would expect to see. So what this, and by the way, we have another sample here, which we don't report on because our sample wasn't large enough statistically. But when you look at the Hispanic voters, just qualitatively in terms of the data, again, because the data sample is not large enough, but when we looked at Hispanic voters, very similar trend, where we were not seeing negatives with Trump, even in the immigration section. Even in the immigration section, Hispanics were very positive, were relatively positive to Trump. So this is, again, very unusual. The key vulnerabilities for Trump were actually no longer vulnerabilities in this particular debate. So that was a very unusual set of results.
It's also quite fascinating, Duane, that such a sensitive topic, such as immigration, had an impact within, the Hispanic population, right? And, this just highlights further the need for these types of methods, right? Because having these types of conversations, even within public forums, right, limits our ability to actually extract how people might want to communicate but are unable to give voice to.
100%. People generally lack access to their own emotional journey. And so anytime you ask a person a question about how they feel about something, they're giving you the rational interpretation. The biometric tools in particular allow us to go past that and to get that layer deeper in terms of what people are actually, how they're actually feeling. And there were some key moments which, again, in terms of the neurometrics, were particularly interesting. For example, there's a part of the debate where Trump is talking about the Ukraine.
Yeah.
And where he says, I will, after I'm elected, I will bring peace to the Ukraine even before the day of my inauguration, right? Now, if you think about that on a rational level, it's unlikely that that could really be the case. But emotionally, it felt good for a lot of the members. I mean, we know this, through the neurometrics. But here's the kicker. It felt good for Democrats as well. So you have this really bizarre moment where rationally they know that this is ridiculous, but emotionally it still feels good. And so this is, again, where this conflict, and really the secret to Trump's success is that Trump is really feeding mostly to people's emotion. And what we know from neuroscience is that emotion trumps over rational. So this is why that particular approach is, on one hand, dangerous, because we don't want to be guided by our emotions. We want to be guided by our rational self. But in terms of a strategy, it's part of the reason why his tactic works.
And it sounds
because
like
of that emotional,
that interesting friction between our rational side and our emotional side, has a lot of different applications within, industry.
For sure,
right?
For sure. In the same way that this matters in this context, there are so many examples of where this emotional rational trade-off or tension is really critical.
Considering our audience today are a lot of our friends and colleagues within the media and advertising industry, if you could sum this up before we dive into questions, Duane, why do you think understanding these insights at this particular depth is critical for our particular industry, the media and advertising industry?
Well, I think there's a number of layers to that. One is, from a methodological point of view, the debate is very unique. We're not used to, especially when we're testing for ads, we're not used to seeing the effects of negative content. We're used to seeing the effects of positive content, like a funny moment in an ad. There are some occasions where an ad has a negative, but it's very rare. This is very unique because we have this rich stimuli that allows us to see negatives as well as positives, in which people are intensely engaged. I mean, some of those moments in debates, people are really, really, really intensely engaged. So let's open it up for some questions.
Yeah,
to
looking
our
forward
audience.
to it. So everyone who's in Heart Connect right now, if you want to go into the chat section, feel free to ask any additional questions that you might have.
Jada, if you could
Fantastic.
pull us up as well, if you could pin us or something so that we're full screen, that'd be great.
Awesome. So this one comes from our dear friend Alyssa Moses. Interesting. Democrats most likely reacted emotionally to Biden's poor performance and abandoned him, not thinking through what that could do to the election. What do you think about that statement, Duane?
Well, that's above my pay grade. like we just focus on understanding what the empirical science tells us. I will say what was very interesting in the qual work, again, this was in partnership with Ipsos. Yeah. And Elizabeth Jarros, who I think is just one of the best moderators out there in the industry, she was doing these sessions. And what was very interesting was that the Democrats who, again, felt stunted on the night, they, of course, didn't feel good about Biden, but by the same token, they couldn't bring themselves to vote for Trump. And this is the conflict that you're going to see. And again, when you say, okay, if the election was held like the next day, what would we expect to see? Because of course, we're 4 months away. Who knows all the things that are going to happen over that 4-month period, right? But if the election was held the next, how would we expect that data to translate into the polling? And what we would argue is it would depress voter turnout. Mm-hmm. So it's not that undecideds would suddenly say we're going to vote for Trump. It's not that Democrats would suddenly go out and vote for Trump. Neither of those are plausible. The most likely thing is that some people who didn't feel good on the night would stay home. And that's a similar effect to what we argued in the 2016 debate, that the effect of this is that it depresses voter turnout for your candidate. And that's the threat. That's the problem.
We've got another great question. With this information, how do you think this will influence the September debates?
Right. So I can't wait for the September debate because it's going to be, I mean, who knows what's going to happen? It may be Biden, it may be somebody else. It may not happen at all. There may be more debates. I mean, all of these are plausible scenarios. But of course, it's unlikely that it will be what we saw here. It will be unique in its own right. But certainly one would expect that expectations for Biden going in, if it were Biden, would be very low. And so that could work to his advantage. I mean, if the State of the Union Biden turned up and did well on the night, it would be disproportionately effective because, of course, that's not in line with what people would have expected.
What I thought also was so fascinating before we had to answer more questions is that we had our insight far faster than the pollsters did in terms of this type of narrative, this type of impact.
That's true.
Don't you think that the industry should be considered?
100%. So in the last election in 2016, we actually had a number of TV networks who had subscribed to the data and who saw our results. Remember that narrative about how, it was much more favorable, it was going to be a much closer election, all of that. And they would all say the same thing. They would say, this is the best data we've ever seen in a debate, but there's no way we're going to put it on air. And I'd say, why not? And they said, the story is too pro-Trump. And we're like, look, we're in the truth business. Like, we have no side. We just want to know what's going on. But there was that fear. And in a similar way, we've struggled, MediaScience has struggled to get our data on air. But these were insights that were available at 9 a.m. the next morning. And so you think about how this could have enriched the discussion, because these are insights really that, as you say, we had ahead of the curve.
There's another great question from our New York City lab manager, Brenda. She asked, were there any insights from the follow-up focus group discussion or survey that support the neurometric findings? And actually, I can begin to answer this one, Duane, because I was watching the follow-up focus groups with Ipsos and Elizabeth live via Heart Connect, the platform that you guys are all on right now. And I can say with a resounding agreement, yes, it's clear from our focus groups that Democratic voters or undecided voters that are leaning Democrat have a significant conflict, right? I think one of them actually began the focus group with, we're damned if we vote for Biden, we're damned if we vote, if we don't go vote, right? So there's a significant conflict that they're suffering from, which is it even worth it to participate? And I think that goes to what our data showcase as well, which is our prediction, at least right now, or what the data says, is that it's going to be an emotional struggle for these Biden supporters to believe that he can win again.
Yeah, there was definitely in that qual research that dilemma, if you will. It didn't translate into votes for Trump, for sure. So it's very unlikely that it would have translated in that way. But voter turnout, I think that's the question.
Excellent. So Amy Rask, COO of MediaScience, asks, compared to previous debates, did this one produce more emotional responses in voters?
No, this was actually less, very significantly less. This was a much more muted debate, again, because so much of the audience was stunned by what happened. So the effect of this was nothing like the 2016, where the reactions were very intense. So it was a very different kind of debate. Every debate is so unique that way.
And if we recall, those key stumbling moments from, at least from Biden, happened at the beginning of the debate.
Well, they happened throughout the debate as it occurred. But,
let's continue. Do you think there will be a spike in Trump supporters from the Democratic side?
No.
I don't think so either.
In the qual work in particular, it was very clear that people's attitude towards Trump was very baked in.
Indeed.
There was not a lot of people struggling with the question of whether they could vote for him. I mean, people were very fast to say we're not comfortable voting for Trump. And that didn't change in the debate. Although we do have a theory, and again, it came out in some of the qual work, that Trump was more restrained in this debate.
Indeed.
And that restraint may have helped him with some of the muting that we saw with women in particular. There were even times where he looked a little bit empathetic, where he was looking at Biden a little bit more. You felt that he was almost worried for him. But of course, none of that diminishes the fact that, he lied every other minute, right? Like there was lots of moments where he was lying through his teeth. And on a rational level, people are very aware of that. And so, again, there was a conflict, that emotional, rational conflict.
We've got another great question from audience member Brittany. A lot of Democrats that I have talked to are definitely undecided, more undecided than they were before, because of the lack of solid answers during the debate. Right? What would you say to that comment?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's always hard. Like in the ideal world, you would have an alternative that you could test against.
Yeah.
And you don't have that here. And certainly a lot of the discussion, certainly in this debate, much of it was looking backwards rather than looking forwards. So they were talking about your policy in Afghanistan, your policy here, So a lot of it was looking more in the rearview mirror and talking about what that meant and interpreting that. So there certainly was not enough discussion about what's to come.
Excellent. Well, I think we're pretty much there in terms of questions and in terms of time. I'd like to thank you again so much for joining us.
It was fun.
Incredible MediaScience webinar.
It was fun. And if people in the audience have, definitely email me. I'm Varan, Varan, @mediascience.com.
Excellent. And we look forward to seeing you again on LinkedIn and all other major platforms. For now, I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. I'm Phillip Lomax, and take care.